The man with a yellow hat is a jerk. The man with a yellow hat is a jerk. The man with the yellow hat is a jerk. Episode 2: The Flooded House and Rocket Ship Fiasco. So once again, the man with the yellow hat has left George alone. Someone knocks on the door and George goes to answer it. It's the mailman. You'd think he'd have told the mailman to put the mail in the mailbox. Then again, you'd think with what happened in the previous books that he'd not leave George alone and unattended. The mailman tells George that he has a letter for him and to put it on his friend's desk so he can read it to him when he gets home. George then decides he wants to write a letter to someone, but then he finds out the man with the yellow hat's pen is out of ink. Gosh! You'd think he'd learn to put ink into his pen on a regular basis when living with a monkey. That should be a mandate for anyone with a monkey as a pet. Always keep the ink pens filled. What a load of incompetence. So because George doesn't know how to open up the lid to the pen, he spills ink all over the floor. Then he decides to clean it up with soap and water. So he pours soap powder, which looks like bubble bath liquid, onto the puddle. Then goes outside, turns on the hose, and brings the hose into the house. This of course results in the whole room filling up with water and lather. What a horrible mess. It'll do mold damage to his house. But if anyone deserves that, it's the irresponsible man with the yellow hat who could not be bothered to put ink into a pen. What a complete and utter fool. So George realizes what a mess it is and ends up going outside to turn off the hose. Then he tries thinking of a way to solve the problem for a long time. And then when he comes back with a plan to shovel the lather out the window, it has all turned into water. Yeah, mold damage. I feel pity if it weren't for the fact his friend is so foolish. So George decides to take a pump from a nearby farm. But he cannot place the pump back home because it is too heavy. Then he thinks one of the animals can help. He sees a goat and tries to put the wire of the pump onto it, but it headbutts him several feet away. Miraculously, George sustains no injury. Then he realizes there is a wooded fenced area by him that has pigs in it. He thinks one of them could help him with the pump. But then when opening the door to that area, all the pigs rush out and George is happy to see them do so. Then he goes to find another animal that can help him. He finds some cows. He realizes now the cow is strong enough to pull the pump for him. He even is able to ride the cow. Unfortunately for George, the farmers who own this place who just found their pigs and are gathering them up to put them back, and after doing so, see him stealing their cow and pump. They rush after him and the cow. Then George escapes by jumping into an old-fashioned pajama gown that is hanging on a clothesline. So then George sees a museum truck going by and jumps into it. He arrives at said museum. I'd like to point out this incompetent guard who is smoking a pipe and reading a newspaper. Seems like a good way to have an accident. Then George goes into the museum where he sees some stuffed animals nearby. Then he goes into a room where there is a giant model of a stegosaurus and a baby stegosaurus. He knows they are not real. Then he hides when some people come in by standing under the foot of the stegosaurus. He touches the foot of the stegosaurus, but then after the people are done looking at it, he sees a tree above them that has nuts on it. They aren't real, but he doesn't know that. He feels very hungry because the irresponsible man with the yellow hat didn't bother leaving food around for him. What an incompetent fool! So George climbs up the giant stegosaurus and onto its head to get the nuts. But when he does so, the whole tree falls down, and so do the dinosaurs. Guards come rushing in and grab George. They put him in a cage. They take him in said cage to a professor. The professor says to take him away from there and to a zoo. As the guards do so, the incompetent man with the yellow hat comes in and says that he knows George and says he has a letter for George mentioned earlier that coincidentally is from the professor I just mentioned. The letter says that the professor wants George to go into the sky at a high altitude in a rocket ship, then press a lever at the right moment so that he can get out of it and parachute to Earth. The professor says all will only be forgiven if George agrees to go into the altitude into the sky in a rocket ship. This is so dangerous. George could get killed. But the man with the yellow hat goes along with it. They give George a spacesuit, oxygen tank, and helmet. Then they launch him into the sky and he presses the lever just in time, parachutes down, and is greeted on the ground by a bunch of people, one of whom is a woman who lives next door to the man with the yellow hat, who worked so hard to get the water out of his house. I really hope he paid her a lot of money for doing so. The professor and the man with the yellow hat are there too. The professor gives George a medal. George is proud, and the story ends with George wearing his medal and looking into a mirror. But was that medal worth George's life? No, it wasn't. Let's prosecute. The man with the yellow hat leaves George alone and also doesn't bother to keep his pen full of ink. This causes George to spill ink on the floor out of ignorance of how to properly put ink in a pen. Then George floods the house to clean up the ink because he's a monkey and doesn't know better. Then because of this, George gets into mischief trying to steal a pump and an animal from a local farm, which results in the farmers chasing him, which results in George jumping into the back of a museum truck, which ends up resulting in George entering the museum, destroying a Stegosaurus exhibit. Then he agrees to let this professor launch George into outer space where he could have died. The man with the yellow hat is a jerk!